Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video today. My name is Colby, and since I'm new here to YouTube, I do just want to give a quick rundown of what I'm hoping to post on this channel. On this channel, I'm hoping to dive deep into some of the lesser known true crime stories and even historical events. And ultimately, I do want to travel to the locations that these events happened. I know not every location is going to be visitable, but I definitely want to try to visit most of the locations that I talk about on this channel. And I am going to start locally, but eventually broaden my horizons and travel longer distances and explore more of the world. And I'm sorry if the lighting changes today. I was really busy throughout the day and had to film at the end of the day. And of course, clouds started rolling in, so it's going in and out of sunlight. So I do apologize. Today's case is a little lesser known in the sense that I haven't seen anyone talk about this case on YouTube, at least the YouTubers that I watch, but there is a movie that's based on this story, so you may have heard about it. The movie is called Alpha Dog, which stars Justin Timberlake. If you've seen this movie, you know more about the story than you actually think, even though they did change a lot of the information in the movie because the court case was happening while they filmed, but for the most part, they did stay pretty true to the true crime story. All right, before I ramble on too much, let's just go ahead and dive into the case. So around 6 in the morning on August 6, 2000, Nicholas Markowitz had snuck out of his house in West Hills, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and ultimately he was trying to avoid an argument with his parents that had started the night before. Nicholas was 15 at the time, so he did find himself going through a little bit of a rebellious phase. Not to say that he was a bad kid, but his mom had found his pipe that he smoked weed out of the night before, and that's what the argument was ultimately about. Around the same time that Nicholas was walking around the streets after just sneaking out, Jesse James Hollywood, who was a controlled substance dealer in town, was on his way to confront Nick's half-brother about a debt that he owed Jesse, and they just so happened to run into Nicholas walking on the streets. They pulled over, jumped him, and threw him into the van. Just like what's portrayed in the movie, this kidnapping happened in broad daylight. So there was people walking around town, neighbors heard the screams. Even in the movie, they list off the amount of possible witnesses that witnessed the kidnapping happen, the events between the kidnapping and the murder, and ultimately no one did anything. After Jesse James Hollywood and some of his gang members abducted Nicholas, they headed a couple hours north of Los Angeles to a town called Santa Barbara, which is unfortunately where Nick spent his last couple of days. Although Nick wasn't a normal kidnap victim, he was able to play video games, party, smoke, do different things with his captors. And for the most part, most people didn't even know that he was kidnapped. There were a few people that he disclosed this to, and they did offer to help. But at the end of the day, Nick said that he didn't want help. He wanted to make sure that his brother got out of this okay, and as long as his brother was okay, then he was okay. According to Susan Markowitz, who is Nick's mom and Ben's stepmom, Nick idolized Ben, and he would have done nothing to jeopardize or escalate the situation between Ben and Jesse James Hollywood, which to me is pretty apparent. The reports vary of how much money Ben owed Jesse James Hollywood. Some reports say as little as $1,200, which is actually the amount that the movie mentions, whereas other reports say as much as $36,000, which is a pretty big gap in difference. But at the end of the day, money issues weren't the only problem that these two had. Reputation was a huge one. For instance, Jesse James Hollywood had a reputation of being all talk and no game, whereas Ben was the complete opposite, and he had no problem showing it. On August 8th, so 2 days after Nick had been kidnapped, Jesse James Hollywood claimed that he was going to be releasing Nick the following day. And as such, a few people got together and planned a goodbye party for Nick and booked a room at the Lemon Tree Inn. But unfortunately, this was not going to be the goodbye party that they thought they were going to be throwing. Earlier that day on August 8th, Jesse James Hollywood made a phone call to a family friend, and that family friend happened to be the family lawyer. On this phone call, Jesse made a hypothetical question of if one man found himself kidnapping another man in order to settle a debt, how much trouble would said man be in if he got caught? To which the lawyer responded with common sense that Kidnapping is kidnapping, however you cut the cookie, and said person would be in a ton of trouble, and proceeded to ask Jesse if he knew who this hypothetical person was. And this spooked Jesse, who hung up the phone right away and began planning his next steps. Ryan Hoyt was a member of Jesse James' crew, and like Ben, he was in debt to Jesse. But unlike Ben, he was, I wouldn't say terrified, but a kiss-ass to Jesse James. And because of that, he was willing to do whatever Jesse asked him to do, and Jesse knew that. For example, Jesse would make Ryan pick up after his dog. He would make him pick up after people at the parties, and just in general, wait hand and foot on most of the people in the gang. Ryan believed that he was going over to Jesse's house to talk about when they were going to take Nick back to his parents. But according to Ryan, when he got there, Jesse said, quote, "We got a little situation. You're gonna take care of it for me, and that's how you're going to clear your debt." Then Jesse handed a bag filled with a semi-automatic rifle to Ryan and said, "Once you execute Nick, your debt will be cleared and I will give you $400. Now, like me, you're probably thinking, why is murder a better scenario than kidnap? But unfortunately, your guess is as good as mine. No one really knows what they were thinking and why they thought murder was the answer. After the pool party, Nick got into the car with Ryan, believing that he was going home to his parents, and instead, Ryan drove him up into the mountains of Santa Barbara to a hiking trail that's known by locals called Lizard's Mouth. No part of me can even fathom what was going through Nick's head at that time, thinking you're gonna be going home to see your parents that you haven't seen in a couple days, you didn't leave on great standing, only to realize that you're not headed to Los Angeles. Instead of big buildings and skyscrapers, you're seeing tall trees and huge boulders, and he had to have known. In the early morning hours of August 9th, the group arrived at Lizard's Mouth and had Nick put duct tape around his wrists and over his mouth. Then they proceeded to march him into the forest a little ways to a predetermined spot that Ryan had a grave that he had dug earlier that day, and proceeded to hit Nick over the head and shoot him 9 times. Even though Nick was in the middle of nowhere, this was a popular hiking trail, and a couple days later, on August 12th, some hikers did find his body and reported the remains to Santa Barbara County Sheriff. Once the police arrived on scene, the hikers took them over to the shallow grave that they had discovered, which was literally just some sticks and foliage from the surrounding areas laid on top of Nick's body. Once they made the positive identification that it was Nick's body, they had to do the unfortunate task of letting his parents know of his passing. Once information started spreading that Nick's body was found, tons of the people that had spent the last couple of days with him went to police to tell them everything that they knew. And within a week, Ryan Hoyt and most of the people in Jesse James Hollywood's crew were arrested, but someone had tipped off Jesse James and he fled the country. The reports vary of where Jesse James Hollywood fled to. Some reports say that he stayed within the country for the first couple of years, going to Colorado and then to the Mojave Desert before fleeing the country. Others say that he fled the country right away, going to Canada and then Brazil. In the movie, it doesn't really talk about that. It just says that he went straight to Brazil and eventually he was caught there. By the time authorities had caught on to Jesse James' whereabouts, he had been on the run for 5 years, and at this point he was down in Brazil with a new name. He was going by the name of Michael Costa Guerrero, and he had gotten a woman pregnant who he also married in hopes of avoiding extradition. But at the end of the day, all of his attempts to avoid capture didn't work for him, and in 2005 he was extradited back to Santa Barbara County. After the trial ended, all of the men had been found guilty to some degree. There was Ryan Hoyt, who had pulled the trigger, and he was sentenced to death, and to this day he is still on death row. Then there was Jesse Rugg, who was with Ryan Hoyt at the scene of the crime, but he was sentenced to life in prison and ultimately only served 11 years after being paroled. Then William Skidmore was charged with kidnapping, and he took a plea bargain and only served 9 years. Then there was Graham Presley, who was the youngest out of all of them at 17 years old, and because of his age, he was sentenced to a juvenile facility, and at 25, he was released. Surprisingly, Jesse James Hollywood was only sentenced to life in prison rather than capital punishment, and the only reason why he escaped the death penalty was because at the end of the day, the court ruled that he was not as responsible as Ryan Hoyt was in the demise of Nicholas Markowitz, which I find that ridiculous, because at the end of the day, this was Jesse James Hollywood's plan to have Nicholas killed. I guess you could argue that Ryan could have taken the gun and turned in Jesse James Hollywood rather than killing Nicholas. But are we avoiding the fact that Jesse James fled for 5 years? I just the whole sentencing was a little ridiculous, and not to say that I understand how the court system works fully, but I just think there was a miss on that, specifically with Jesse James. And that is all I could find on this case. There wasn't much out there on it, although from the movie to the research that I did, the movie did stay pretty true to the real events. Really, they only changed locations and names of people because, like I said, they were filming while the court case was happening, so legally they had to do that. But if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend watching it. If you have seen it, I would be interested to hear down in the comments below what you think of the movie, if you knew the real events, or what you thought about the real events after hearing about them. Personally, this was a really interesting case to research because I did grow up in Santa Barbara, so therefore I grew up knowing about this case. Although I was only 5 or 6 when it occurred, so I don't remember the events occurring, but I would go up to Lizard's Mouth all the time with my friends, and we would hike those trails. Sometimes we would go to the grave marker that's up there for him and pay our respects. His body's not there anymore. I think his parents took him down to Los Angeles to a gravesite down there. But when I was starting the research of this case, I did take my husband up there for the first time and showed him the gravesite. And we actually took our spirit box. I'll go ahead and put the video here.
Take out the thing.
Is anyone here right now? We're looking for Nicholas Markowitz. Nicholas, if you're here, can you please say something? This device helps you speak to us. Is it dead?
Go where?
Do you want us to leave? If there's anything you want to say, you can use this device to say it to us. I know that the way that you died was very brutal. But we believe we did talk to Nicholas Markowitz, and we left pretty quickly because it seemed like he didn't want to be disturbed. All I could hear while listening to the spirit box was the word go being repeated over and over and over. Not sure if you can hear anything that I'm missing. Definitely leave a comment below if you can hear something more. but for the most part, it just sounded like whoever we were talking to did not want to be disturbed, so we did end the session pretty quickly and left. But that's where I'm going to wrap up today's video. I apologize on how heart-wrenching this story is, but I hope you did learn something. And like I said, if you have seen the movie but you learned something from this video, definitely leave in the comments what you learned. And if you haven't seen the movie, I definitely recommend watching it with the knowledge that you might have learned from today's video. But that is going to do it, and I will see you in next week's upload. I haven't figured out my schedule yet with uploading on YouTube since this is my first video, but my goal is to be putting a video out once a week, so I hope to see you next week.